In the quiet stillness of dawn, when the mist clung to the fields and the world was just beginning to wake, there was a sound of frantic, uneven rhythm, like a drum with a broken beat. A horse, coated in mud and trembling with exhaustion, stumbled through the outskirts of a small rural town. Its coat, once gleaming and proud, was now dull and matted, marred by scrapes and streaks of dried blood. Its eyes darted wildly, wide with fear, as if it had seen things no living creature should ever witness. No one knew where it had come from, but one thing was clear: it had endured something unimaginable. The first person to spot it was an old farmer heading to his barn to feed the animals. He froze mid-step, his breath catching in his throat as the horse limped into view, its legs trembling under the weight of its own body. It looked like it might collapse at any moment. The farmer called out softly, his voice shaking with both concern and amazement. The horse didn't run, it couldn't. Instead, it stood there, swaying slightly, as if deciding whether to trust this stranger. By the time the farmer reached for his phone to call for help, others had begun to notice. Word spread quickly through the town, as it tends to in places like this. A horse in such a state, it wasn't something anyone could ignore. Some speculated it had been lost in the wild for months, battling predators and starvation. Others whispered about cruel owners who might have abandoned it after pushing it too hard. But no one could deny the sheer resilience it must have taken to survive whatever horrors it had faced. Its very presence was a testament to its will to live. When the animal rescue team arrived, even they were stunned. The horse's injuries told a story that no words could. Deep gashes along its flank hinted at a desperate escape, perhaps from a barbed wire fence or an attack. Its hooves were cracked, its ribs prominent beneath its thin, battered coat. But it was its eyes that told the most haunting story, eyes that held both pain and an unyielding determination. This wasn't just any horse. This was a survivor. As the team worked carefully to load the horse into a trailer, it flinched at every movement, every sound. It had clearly learned that the world could be a dangerous place. But there was a spark in its eyes, something that refused to be extinguished. The people who gathered to watch couldn't help but feel a strange mix of sorrow and hope. This horse had suffered more than most could imagine, yet it had fought to stay alive. Why? What was it running from? And what kept it going when the odds were so heavily stacked against it? Once the horse was safely in the care of a local rescue shelter, the questions only deepened. The vet who examined it was baffled by its injuries, which suggested it had traveled an extraordinary distance through harsh conditions. They found scars that were months old, evidence of past battles that the horse had somehow survived. It was as if this animal had been fighting for its life for as long as anyone could remember. But the more they uncovered about its past, the more mysterious its story became. The shelter staff began the slow process of earning the horse's trust, offering gentle words and fresh hay. It was skittish at first, backing away from even the slightest gesture. But there were moments, fleeting and fragile, when it seemed to let its guard down, just enough to accept kindness. And in those moments, it was clear this horse wasn't just surviving. It was beginning to heal. But just as things seemed to settle, a startling discovery threw everything into question. Hidden beneath the layers of mud and scars was a faint, nearly illegible brand on the horse's flank, a mark that hinted at a past far more complex than anyone had imagined. It wasn't just any horse. This was a horse that had been part of something bigger, something people in the town would never have guessed. And as the shelter staff began to unravel the mystery, they realized the horse's journey was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. This discovery set off a chain of events that no one could have predicted, drawing in strangers from distant places, each with their own secrets and motives. Who did this horse belong to? What had it escaped from? And why did its story seem to resonate so deeply with everyone who heard it? These questions hung in the air, unanswered, as the horse stood quietly in its stall, its fate now tied to the people who had found it. Little did anyone know, the story of this horse would soon become something far greater than a tale of survival. It would become a story of redemption, resilience, and the lengths some would go to uncover the truth. And as the sun set over the small town that night, the horse rested for what might have been the first time in a long while, unaware of the storm that was about to come. The days that followed were a blur of cautious care and quiet observation. At the rescue shelter, the horse was given a warm stall, soft bedding, and the kind of gentle attention it had likely never known before. The team, a mix of volunteers and experienced handlers, worked tirelessly to make the animal feel safe. They named it Shadow, not just because of its dark, worn coat but because of the way it seemed to move like a fleeting shadow, always wary, always on edge. Yet beneath its fear, there was an undeniable strength, a stubborn spark of life that refused to fade. Shadow's condition slowly began to improve. The wounds on its body, though severe, were treatable, and with time and care they began to heal. But the mental scars ran deeper. The horse remained jumpy, flinching at sudden movements and shrinking back from unfamiliar voices. Even the softest touch could send it retreating to the corner of its stall, eyes wide and ears pinned back. It was as though every fiber of its being was ready to flee at the first sign of danger. The shelter's staff and volunteers were patient, understanding that trust would come slowly, if at all. A young woman who spent most of her free time at the shelter seemed to connect with Shadow in a way no one else could. She would sit outside the stall for hours, speaking in a low, soothing voice about nothing in particular, just stories, memories, whatever came to mind. Shadow would listen, its ears twitching toward the sound of her voice, though it never stepped closer. The brand on Shadow's flank, however, remained a mystery. It was faint and partially obscured by old scars, but it was unmistakable, a mark that spoke of ownership, of a past life that no one could yet piece together. The shelter's director took photos and sent them to several equine organizations, hoping someone might recognize it. Days turned into weeks with no answers, but the questions only grew louder. Who had owned this horse? What had it endured? And why had it ended up alone, broken, and battered in the middle of nowhere? One evening, as the staff prepared to close up for the night, an older man arrived at the shelter. He was quiet, unassuming, but there was a weight to his presence, as though he carried stories he had yet to share. He introduced himself as someone who had worked with horses for decades, drawn to the shelter after hearing about Shadow through the town's grapevine. He asked if he could see the horse, and though the staff hesitated, they eventually led him to the stall. The moment the man laid eyes on Shadow, something in his expression shifted. He didn't speak right away, just stood there, taking in every detail: the scars, the brand, the wary way the horse held its head. Finally, he murmured, almost to himself, "This horse has seen the worst of humanity." His words hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. He asked about the brand, and when the staff showed him the photos, his face darkened. He didn't recognize it outright, but he said it resembled marks used by certain operations, ones that didn't exactly follow the rules. When pressed for more information, he hesitated, as though deciding how much to reveal. Finally, he admitted that there were places hidden, isolated places where horses were treated as commodities, pushed to their limits for profit. If Shadow had come from one of those places, it was no wonder the horse was so damaged, so terrified. The shelter staff listened in silence, a mix of anger and heartbreak washing over them. It was one thing to suspect that Shadow had suffered, it was another to hear it spoken aloud, to imagine the horrors the horse might have endured. The older man offered to help in any way he could, though his eyes betrayed a sadness that suggested he wasn't sure how much could be done. That night, as the shelter emptied out and the lights were dimmed, Shadow stood quietly in its stall, unaware of the storm of emotions swirling around it. The young woman who had spent so much time with the horse lingered a little longer, her heart heavy with both sorrow and determination. She didn't know who had hurt Shadow or why, but she was certain of one thing: she wouldn't let the horse suffer again. Meanwhile, miles away, someone else was thinking about Shadow. A man sat at a cluttered desk, a faint scowl on his face as he flipped through a stack of papers. His phone buzzed, and he answered it with a curt greeting. The voice on the other end was sharp, urgent, and though their words were indistinct, their tone made one thing clear: they were worried. The man's scowl deepened as he listened, his fingers tapping impatiently on the desk. Finally, he muttered something under his breath, then hung up. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the papers in front of him. Among them was a photograph, a blurry image of a dark horse with a faint brand on its flank. Back at the shelter, Shadow's progress continued, slow but steady. The horse began to eat more, to move with a little less hesitation. There were even moments when it seemed to relax, its head lowering as it stood quietly in its stall. But there were still times when a door slammed, or when someone raised their voice, when the fear came rushing back, overwhelming and uncontrollable. The shelter staff did their best to create a calm, safe environment, but they couldn't control everything. And as much as they wanted to believe Shadow's troubles were behind it, the unease lingering in the back of their minds wouldn't go away. The brand, the scars, the way the horse had been found, it all pointed to a story that was far from over. Then, one morning, a letter arrived at the shelter. It was handwritten, the words hurried and uneven, as though the writer had been in a rush. The message was brief but chilling: that horse doesn't belong to you. Stop asking questions. The shelter's director read the letter twice, her hands shaking slightly. She didn't recognize the handwriting, and there was no return address. When she showed it to the staff, a heated debate broke out. Some thought it was just a prank, someone trying to scare them. Others weren't so sure. The young woman who had spent so much time with Shadow felt a knot of fear tighten in her chest. She couldn't explain it, but she knew deep down that the letter was more than just a threat. Someone was watching, someone who didn't want Shadow's story to be uncovered. And whoever they were, they wouldn't stop until the truth was buried. The letter marked a turning point, though no one could agree on what to do next. The shelter staff debated in hushed voices behind closed doors, their concern for Shadow growing alongside their unease. Should they go to the police? But what could they say? A threatening note tied to a mysterious horse? It wasn't exactly the kind of case that would command immediate attention. Still, the uneasiness lingered, and the question of who had sent the letter hung over them like a dark cloud. The young woman couldn't shake the feeling that Shadow's story was much bigger than anyone realized. Late at night, when the shelter was quiet and still, she would sit by the horse's stall, watching the animal as it dozed fitfully. Shadow had moments of peace now, moments when the haunted look in its eyes seemed to soften. But even in sleep, its body twitched as though it were running from something. The young woman wanted to believe she could help Shadow heal, but how could she protect the horse from a threat she didn't fully understand? Meanwhile, the older man who had come to the shelter remained a steady, though somewhat enigmatic, presence. He returned often, spending long hours talking with the staff and observing Shadow. He never said much about his past, but every so often, he would drop a comment or ask a question that hinted at a deep knowledge of the darker side of the horse world. One day, as he stood by the stall, he said quietly, "Horses like this, they don't just disappear. Someone's looking for it." The weight of his words settled heavily on the young woman. She asked him what he meant, but he just shook his head. "If I'm right," he said, "you've got more to worry about than anonymous letters." Around this time, a stranger appeared at the shelter. He arrived unannounced, claiming to be a horse trainer from a nearby town. He said he'd heard about Shadow and wanted to offer his services, insisting that he had experience working with traumatized animals. But there was something about him that didn't sit right. His smile was too smooth, his questions too pointed. He asked about the horse's injuries, its behavior, and most concerning its brand. When the staff told him they weren't looking for outside help, he left without protest, but his presence left an uneasy tension behind. The shelter's director decided to tighten security. They added locks to the barn doors and installed cameras around the property. It felt like an overreaction to some, but others found comfort in the added precautions. The young woman, however, felt more exposed than ever. Whoever had sent the letter, whoever that stranger was, they weren't going to give up easily. And Shadow, despite its growing strength, remained vulnerable. As the days passed, the brand on Shadow's flank became an obsession for the young woman. She spent hours online, searching databases, forums, and archives, trying to match the faint symbol to anything that could provide answers. She reached out to equine experts, rescue groups, even private investigators, but no one seemed to recognize it. The brand was like a ghost, a relic from a world that didn't want to be found. One night, frustrated and exhausted, she found herself staring at the photo of the brand yet again. It was a simple design, almost crude, but there was something about it that nagged at her, something familiar she couldn't quite place. On a whim, she decided to reverse her approach. Instead of looking for the brand in databases, she searched for reports of missing horses, focusing on cases where the details were vague or suspicious. Hours passed, and just as she was about to give up, she found a report from several states away about a group of horses that had disappeared from a ranch under mysterious circumstances. The article was short, with few details, but one line stood out: authorities suspect the horses may have been taken for illegal use in underground operations. Her heart raced as she read and reread the article. Could Shadow have been one of those horses? The timeline matched, and the description of the stolen animals was vague enough to fit. But what did underground operations mean? She didn't want to jump to conclusions, but her gut told her she was onto something. The next day, she shared what she'd found with the older man. He listened quietly, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he nodded slowly. "It's a lead," he said. "But if you dig too deep, you might not like what you find." She pressed him for more information, but he was reluctant to say much. All he would admit was that he'd heard whispers over the years about illegal auctions and racing circuits, places where horses were treated as disposable tools for profit. "If this horse came from a place like that," he said, "there are people out there who won't want it traced back to them." The young woman felt a chill run through her. She wanted to help Shadow, but she hadn't realized how dangerous the situation might be. Still, she couldn't walk away, not now, not when she was so close to understanding what the horse had been through. But as she dug deeper, strange things began to happen. One evening, she returned to the shelter to find Shadow's stall door slightly ajar. Nothing seemed out of place, and the horse was unharmed, but it was enough to set her nerves on edge. Then there were the phone calls, silent calls from unknown numbers that came at odd hours, leaving her feeling watched. And then there was the car. She noticed it one afternoon while driving home, a dark vehicle that seemed to follow her for several miles before turning off. She told herself it was a coincidence, but the knot of fear in her stomach told a different story. At the shelter, Shadow's recovery continued, but the horse's behavior remained unpredictable. Some days, it seemed almost content, nuzzling the young woman's hand or resting its head against her shoulder. Other days, it was as though the horse could sense the tension in the air, pacing its stall and snorting nervously at every noise. It was as if Shadow knew that the past it had escaped from wasn't done chasing it. And it wasn't. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the shelter received another letter. This one was more direct, more threatening. "You've been warned. Let the horse go, or there will be consequences." The young woman read the note with shaking hands, her mind racing. She couldn't understand how anyone could want to harm a creature that had already suffered so much. But whoever these people were, they weren't going to back down. Shadow wasn't just a survivor, it was a witness. And someone out there was determined to silence it, no matter the cost. The second letter left the shelter staff shaken. It was no longer just a veiled warning, it was a direct threat. The director, who had tried to remain level-headed throughout, called an emergency meeting. They discussed everything: the letters, the strange man who had come asking questions, the security footage that showed nothing unusual but failed to calm anyone's nerves. Despite their fear, they all agreed on one thing: Shadow was not going anywhere. Whatever this horse had been through, it had found sanctuary, and they wouldn't give it up so easily. But the sense of safety they tried so hard to create began to erode. Every sound seemed louder, every shadow longer. Volunteers started looking over their shoulders when walking through the barn at night. The cameras provided some reassurance, but not enough. They'd all seen too many stories where people with bad intentions found ways to bypass even the best precautions. The young woman felt the pressure most of all. Shadow had become more than just a rescue to her. The horse represented something deeper, something fragile and raw that she couldn't put into words. Every time she looked into those dark, wary eyes, she was reminded of how much trust Shadow had placed in her, and how easily it could be broken. She couldn't let that happen. Her research into Shadow's past became an obsession. She contacted the reporter who had written the article about the stolen horses, hoping they might have more information. To her surprise, the reporter agreed to meet. They met at a quiet CF in a neighboring town, and as soon as they sat down, the reporter lowered their voice and leaned in close. Those horses, the reporter said, weren't just stolen. They were funneled into something bigger, a network that moves animals across state lines for illegal purposes. It's a lucrative trade, and the people running it will do anything to keep it hidden. The young woman felt her stomach drop. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made it all the more terrifying. She asked if they thought Shadow could be one of those horses. The reporter hesitated, then nodded. It's possible, they said. And if it is, you're dealing with people who won't stop until they get what they want. That night, as she drove back to the shelter, her mind raced. She couldn't shake the reporter's words, couldn't stop thinking about the network they had described. Shadow wasn't just a victim, it was evidence. Keeping the horse safe wasn't just about healing its wounds, it was about protecting it from people who saw it as a loose end. When she arrived at the shelter, the barn was quiet, the lights casting long shadows across the stalls. Shadow was standing at the back of its stall, ears twitching at the faint sounds of the night. The young woman approached slowly, speaking in a low, calm voice. "Hey, it's okay," she murmured. "You're safe." But was that true? Every instinct told her the danger was getting closer. She decided to stay at the shelter overnight, setting up a small cot in the office so she could be close in case anything happened. She wasn't the only one who felt uneasy. The older man had been visiting the shelter more frequently, his presence a quiet reassurance even as his warnings grew more urgent. "You need to be ready," he told her one evening. "If they come for that horse, it won't be a knock at the door." The words replayed in her mind as she lay on the cot, staring at the ceiling. Sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the barn, every gust of wind outside, made her heart race. She finally drifted off in the early hours of the morning, only to be startled awake by the sound of Shadow's restless pacing. She grabbed a flashlight and rushed to the stall, her pulse pounding. Shadow was agitated, its eyes wide and its movements sharp and jerky. "What's wrong?" she whispered, though she knew the horse couldn't answer. As she scanned the barn, the beam of her flashlight caught something, a flicker of movement outside the window. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Was it just the wind? Or was someone out there? She didn't have to wonder for long. A loud crash echoed through the barn as the main door was forced open. Shadow reared back, letting out a panicked whinny. The young woman's heart leapt into her throat as she fumbled for her phone, her hands shaking. Before she could dial, she saw them, two figures silhouetted against the dim light, moving with purpose. "Stay back!" she shouted, her voice trembling but loud enough to cut through the chaos. The figures hesitated for a moment, then one of them stepped forward. "We're taking the horse," a gruff voice said. You don't understand what you're dealing with. I understand enough, she shot back, holding her ground even as fear clawed at her. This horse doesn't belong to you. The man laughed, a cold, humorless sound. It doesn't belong to you either. Step aside, and no one gets hurt. But she didn't move. Behind her, Shadow was trembling, its breath coming in sharp, shallow bursts. The young woman didn't know how she was going to stop them, but she knew she couldn't let them take the horse. Not after everything Shadow had been through. Not after everything they'd uncovered. The standoff felt like it lasted forever, the air thick with tension. Then, from somewhere outside, there was a sudden burst of light, a car pulling into the driveway, its headlights slicing through the darkness. The figures hesitated, glancing at each other. The young woman didn't waste a second. She grabbed a metal tool from a nearby shelf and slammed it against the side of the stall, the loud clang startling both Shadow and the intruders. "Leave now!" she shouted, her voice rising with desperation. The figures cursed under their breath and retreated, slipping out the way they had come. She didn't relax until the barn door slammed shut behind them. The car in the driveway turned out to be the older man. He had come to check on things, his instincts proving right once again. When she told him what had happened, his expression darkened. "They're not going to stop," he said grimly. "You need to figure out your next move and fast." But what was the next move? The young woman felt trapped, caught in a web of danger and uncertainty. She wanted to protect Shadow, to give the horse the safe, peaceful life it deserved. But how could she do that when the people who had hurt it once were determined to take it back? And what would they do if they succeeded? As dawn broke, she stood by Shadow's stall, stroking its neck as the horse slowly calmed. "I won't let them hurt you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "No matter what it takes." But deep down, she knew the fight was far from over. The people chasing Shadow weren't just dangerous, they were relentless. And if they came back, they wouldn't be so easily scared off. The morning air was heavy with unease, a tense silence blanketing the shelter as everyone went about their tasks with wary eyes. The attempted intrusion left no room for complacency, and while Shadow seemed calmer after the commotion, the young woman couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was closing in. She barely slept that night, replaying every detail of the encounter, every word the intruders had spoken. What did they mean when they said she didn't understand what she was dealing with? And why had they backed off so easily? The older man lingered at the shelter longer than usual, walking the perimeter and inspecting every lock, every camera angle. He wasn't one for small talk, but his eyes were sharp, scanning for weaknesses. At one point, he approached the young woman, his voice low. "There's something I haven't told you," he began, his tone reluctant. "I didn't just stumble onto this shelter by chance. I've been looking for this horse or one like it for a long time." Her heart skipped a beat as she stared at him, trying to read his expression. "What do you mean?" she asked cautiously. He sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "There's a network out there," he said. "People who trade in horses like Shadow. They take them for underground races, illegal betting, worse things you don't even want to imagine. It's a dark world, and once a horse is in, it's almost impossible to get them out. But Shadow's different." "Different how?" she pressed, her mind racing. "I've been tracking this network for years," he said. "And every so often, a horse comes along that they don't want anyone to know about. Special horses, ones with bloodlines or traits that make them valuable beyond the usual profit. Shadow was part of something bigger, something they were trying to keep hidden. That brand? It's not just a mark of ownership. It's a code. And if I'm right, it could lead us straight to the people at the top." The weight of his words hit her like a blow. Shadow wasn't just a victim, it was a key, a living piece of evidence in a much larger puzzle. The stakes weren't just about saving one horse anymore, they were about exposing an entire operation. But if that was true, it also explained why the intruders were so desperate to get the horse back. Shadow wasn't just a liability to them, it was a threat. As the man spoke, a flicker of doubt crept into her mind. She trusted him, he had been a steady presence through the chaos, but why was he telling her this now? And what did he really want from Shadow? Before she could voice her concerns, he interrupted her thoughts. "There's something else," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "The people who came last night. They weren't just hired muscle. They were scouts. They were testing your defenses, seeing how far they could push. Next time, they won't be so subtle." Her breath caught as the implications sank in. Next time. The word echoed in her mind, carrying with it the promise of more danger. She wanted to believe they could outlast whatever was coming, but deep down, she knew they were outmatched. The shelter wasn't a fortress. It was a sanctuary, built to heal and protect, not to fend off an organized threat. The tension only escalated when she received an anonymous phone call that afternoon. The voice on the other end was calm, almost polite, but the message was chilling. "You're in over your head," the caller said. "Walk away while you still can. The horse isn't worth it." She tried to ask who they were, where they were calling from, but the line went dead before she could get another word out. Her hands trembled as she set the phone down, her mind spinning. It wasn't just a threat, it was a warning, a final chance to back off before things escalated further. That evening, as she sat in the office trying to process everything, one of the volunteers rushed in, their face pale. "You need to come see this," they said, their voice tight with urgency. She followed them outside to find the main gate to the shelter wide open. The lock had been cut clean through, the chain discarded on the ground. Her stomach twisted as she ran to the barn, her heart pounding with every step. When she reached Shadow's stall, she found the horse unharmed but visibly distressed, its eyes wild and its body trembling. Someone had been there, someone had gotten close. The older man appeared at her side, his face grim. "They're sending a message," he said. "They want you to know they can get in whenever they want." She felt a surge of anger rise within her, cutting through the fear that had taken root. "Then let them come," she said through gritted teeth. "I'm not giving up on this horse." But as determined as she felt, she knew they couldn't keep going like this. The shelter wasn't equipped to handle this kind of danger, and every moment they kept Shadow there put everyone at risk. She needed a plan, a way to protect the horse while also uncovering the truth about its past. That night, as she sat alone in the barn, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. The text was short but ominous: "Time's up." She stared at the screen, her mind racing. Was it another scare tactic, or did it mean something more? The answer came sooner than she expected. Minutes later, the barn lights flickered and went out, plunging the space into darkness. Shadow let out a sharp, panicked cry, and the sound of footsteps echoed outside. They weren't waiting anymore. They were here. The darkness in the barn was suffocating, broken only by the faint glow of her phone's screen. Shadow's breathing was sharp and uneven, the sound cutting through the silence like a warning. She could hear footsteps now, deliberate and steady, crunching against the gravel outside. Her pulse hammered in her ears, and every instinct screamed at her to run, but she couldn't leave Shadow. Not now. Gripping the flashlight in one hand and her phone in the other, she took a slow, shaky step toward the stall. The older man had insisted on staying overnight after the last incident, but where was he now? She fumbled to call him, her fingers trembling too much to hit the right buttons. A loud metallic clang echoed outside, followed by the unmistakable sound of the barn door creaking open. They were inside. Her flashlight flicked on with a sharp click, the beam cutting through the darkness and landing on a figure just inside the doorway. The man from before, the one who had demanded Shadow, stood there, his face set in a grim determination. Behind him, Another figure loomed, taller and broader, carrying something in their hand that glinted faintly in the light. "You had your chance," the first man said, his voice low but carrying a cold edge. "Step aside." Her throat tightened, but she held her ground, raising the flashlight as if it could somehow protect her. "You're not taking this horse," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "Not tonight. Not ever." The man laughed, a short, humorless sound. "You don't understand what you're doing," he said. "That horse doesn't belong here. It belongs to us." Shadows shifted restlessly in the stall behind her, the tension in the air palpable. The young woman's mind raced, trying to think of a way out. She could hear faint movement now, someone else approaching from outside. Were there more of them? She was outnumbered, unarmed, and completely vulnerable. But just as the man stepped forward, there was a sudden shout from outside. The older man appeared in the doorway, his silhouette backlit by the faint light of the moon. He was holding something, a heavy wooden staff, worn but sturdy. "That's far enough," he said, his voice carrying an authority she hadn't heard before. The intruders hesitated, exchanging glances. "You don't want to do this, old man," the first man said, his tone laced with warning. But the older man didn't waver. He stepped inside, positioning himself between the young woman and the intruders, the staff held firmly in his hands. "What you're doing ends here," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "This horse has suffered enough. You're not taking it back." The tension was unbearable, the air thick with the threat of violence. The first man's expression hardened, and for a moment, it seemed like he might lunge forward. But then, a sound broke the standoff, a sharp, piercing whistle that echoed through the barn. Everyone froze, their heads snapping toward the entrance. Another figure stepped into the barn, this one dressed in a dark coat and moving with a deliberate, almost casual confidence. The flashlight beam caught their face, revealing a sharp jawline and cold eyes. They didn't look like someone who belonged in a barn, they looked like someone who gave orders and expected them to be followed. "Enough," the newcomer said, their voice cutting through the tension like a knife. The first man immediately stepped back, his defiance melting into something closer to fear. The young woman's grip on the flashlight tightened as she stared at the new arrival, trying to read their intentions. "This has gone on long enough," the newcomer said, their gaze shifting to the young woman. "You have no idea what you're protecting." "I know exactly what I'm protecting," she shot back, her voice firm despite the fear threatening to choke her. "And I won't let you take it." The newcomer tilted their head, studying her for a long moment. "Do you, though?" they said, their tone almost mocking. "Do you really know what that horse is worth? What it represents?" Their words sent a chill down her spine, but she refused to back down. "I know it's worth more than whatever you're planning to do with it." The newcomer smirked, but there was no humor in it. "You're brave," they said. "I'll give you that. But bravery won't save you." They turned to the older man, their expression hardening. "You've meddled enough. You have no idea the damage you've done." The older man's grip on the staff tightened, his jaw set. "The only damage here is what you've done to these animals," he said. "And it ends tonight." The newcomer's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, it seemed like the situation might erupt into chaos. But then, Shadow let out a sudden, sharp cry, the sound so raw and piercing that it cut through the tension like a blade. The horse reared back in its stall, its eyes wide and wild, and the young woman turned just in time to see something she hadn't noticed before. A faint scar beneath Shadow's coat, hidden by the dark coloring but now illuminated by the flashlight. It wasn't the brand, it was something else, something deeper. Her breath caught as she realized what it was. A surgical scar. "What did you do to this horse?" she demanded, her voice rising with anger. The newcomer's smirk faltered for the first time, replaced by something colder. "That's none of your concern," they said. Hand it over, and you can walk away. But the young woman wasn't listening. Her mind raced, piecing together everything she'd learned. Shadow wasn't just part of the network. It wasn't just a victim. It was a test subject. The scar told her everything she needed to know. Shadow had been experimented on, altered in ways she couldn't yet understand. And now, the people responsible wanted it back. Before she could react, the barn lights flickered back on, flooding the space with harsh, artificial light. The sudden brightness startled everyone, and in the chaos, Shadow kicked against the stall door, breaking it open. The horse bolted, charging through the barn and out into the open night. The intruders scrambled to follow, but the older man stepped in their way, his staff swinging in a wide arc. "Go!" he shouted at the young woman. "Take the horse and go!" Her legs moved before her mind could catch up, her feet pounding against the dirt as she ran after Shadow. The horse was fast, but fear made her faster, her determination propelling her forward. She caught up just as Shadow slowed near the edge of the field, its body trembling with exhaustion. Grabbing the lead rope, she whispered soothing words, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. Behind her, she could hear shouts and the sound of footsteps, but she didn't look back. Shadow needed her, and she wouldn't fail it now. As she led the horse into the dense cover of the nearby woods, her mind was already racing with plans. They couldn't stay at the shelter, it wasn't safe anymore. But there were other places, other people who could help. She just had to get Shadow there before it was too late. The night was far from over, and the fight was far from won. But as the woods closed around them, she felt a spark of hope. Shadow was still with her, still fighting. And as long as they were together, she knew they had a chance. The woods were eerily quiet as she led Shadow deeper into the dense thicket, the crunch of leaves beneath her boots the only sound breaking the stillness. Every so often, the horse would pause, its ears swiveling at some distant noise, but she urged it gently forward, her own senses heightened. The weight of the night's events bore down on her, but she couldn't afford to dwell on the fear or the questions swirling in her mind. Right now, the only thing that mattered was getting Shadow to safety. She didn't stop until she reached a narrow creek, its water glinting faintly in the moonlight. Shadow hesitated, its hooves sinking slightly into the muddy bank, but she coaxed it across, her voice soft and steady. On the other side, she found a cluster of tall pines, their branches forming a natural canopy that shielded them from view. It wasn't much, but it would have to do for now. Dropping to her knees, she ran her hands along Shadow's side, checking for any injuries. The horse was still trembling, its eyes wide and frantic, but it seemed unharmed. She let out a shaky breath, resting her forehead against its neck. "We're okay," she whispered, more to herself than to the horse. "We're okay." But even as she said the words, she knew the reprieve was temporary. The people after Shadow wouldn't stop, they had made that clear. And while the older man had bought her time, she had no way of knowing if he was still holding them off, or if they had already regrouped and were back on her trail. She needed help, someone who could guide her through this tangled web she'd stumbled into. Her mind went to a name the older man had mentioned once, weeks ago, when he first arrived at the shelter. A retired veterinarian who had spent years exposing unethical practices in the racing industry. She didn't know much about him, only that he lived far outside town and had connections to people who might be willing to help. It was a long shot, but it was all she had. Digging her phone out of her pocket, she typed his name into the search bar, her fingers trembling with urgency. A few results popped up, articles about his work, a grainy photo of him at some protests, but what she needed was a way to contact him. She scrolled until she found an address, a farm located miles away on the outskirts of the county. It would be a hard journey, especially with Shadow, but staying here wasn't an option. She stood, brushing dirt off her jeans, and tugged gently on Shadow's lead rope. "Come on, boy," she said softly. "We've got a long way to go." The hours that followed were a blur of exhaustion and determination. They stayed off the main roads, weaving through back trails and open fields to avoid being seen. The weight of the night pressed heavily on her, but Shadow's quiet resilience kept her moving. Every time she felt her strength falter, she looked at the horse and remembered why she was doing this. By the time the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, they were nearing the edge of the farm listed in the address. It was a sprawling property, its fields dotted with grazing horses and weathered barns. For the first time in what felt like days, she felt a glimmer of hope. If anyone could help her, it was the man who lived here. She approached cautiously, her eyes scanning the property for any signs of activity. As she neared the house, an older man stepped onto the porch, his figure silhouetted against the rising sun. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and a flannel shirt, his posture relaxed but his gaze sharp as it landed on her and Shadow. "You're trespassing," he called out, his voice gruff but not unkind. "I need help," she said, her voice cracking from exhaustion. "It's about this horse." The man descended the steps slowly, his eyes narrowing as he took in Shadow's trembling form. "That's not just any horse," he said, more to himself than to her. "Where did you find it?" "It's a long story," she said, her legs threatening to give out beneath her. "But there are people after us, dangerous people. Please, I don't know where else to go." The man studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Bring it inside the barn," he said. "We'll talk." Relief flooded through her as she led Shadow toward the barn, its doors creaking open to reveal a spacious interior lined with empty stalls. The man motioned for her to bring the horse into one of them, and she did so, her hands still shaking as she removed the lead rope. As she stepped back, the man approached, his expression unreadable. "That horse has been through hell," he said, running a hand along Shadow's side. "But there's something else, isn't there? Something you're not telling me." She hesitated, unsure how much to reveal, but the weight of the secret was too much to carry alone. "There's a scar," she said quietly. "On its side. I think it was experimented on." The man's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening. "That would explain a lot," he muttered. "I've seen cases like this before. Horses taken for illegal testing, modified to enhance their performance in ways that defy ethics and reason. It's a dirty business, and the people behind it don't take kindly to losing their investments." Her stomach turned at his words, the reality of what Shadow had endured sinking in. "Can you help him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man looked at her, his gaze softening. "I'll do what I can," he said. "But you need to be prepared for what comes next. If the people after this horse are who I think they are, they won't stop until they get it back." Over the next few days, the man worked tirelessly to assess Shadow's condition, his expertise shining through in every careful movement. The young woman stayed close, helping where she could and keeping a constant watch for any signs of danger. She learned more about the man's past, his years of fighting against the very network that had taken Shadow, his relentless pursuit of justice even when it came at great personal cost. Together, they pieced together a plan. The man had connections to an organization that specialized in rescuing animals from situations like this, providing them with safe havens far from the reach of those who sought to exploit them. It was risky, but it was the best chance Shadow had. As the days turned into weeks, the threat that had loomed so large began to fade, though it never disappeared entirely. The intruders hadn't returned, but their absence felt more like a storm brewing on the horizon than a true retreat. Still, the young woman refused to live in fear. She poured all her energy into helping Shadow heal, watching as the horse slowly regained its strength and trust. The final goodbye came on a cool morning, the air crisp with the promise of a new season. The organization had sent a transport team to take Shadow to a sanctuary in a remote location, a place where the horse could live out its days in peace. The young woman stood by as they loaded Shadow into the trailer, her heart heavy but full of hope. You did good, the older man said, placing a hand on her shoulder. Not many people would have gone this far. She smiled faintly, her eyes never leaving Shadow. He deserved a chance, she said. They all do. As the trailer pulled away, disappearing down the winding dirt road, she felt a sense of closure she hadn't thought possible. The journey had been long and harrowing, but it had brought her to a place of understanding not just about the cruelty that existed in the world, but also about the strength and resilience it took to fight against it. In the weeks that followed, she returned to the shelter, her purpose renewed. She shared Shadow's story with anyone who would listen, using it as a call to action for those who cared about the welfare of animals. The older man stayed in touch, sending updates from the sanctuary and continuing his work to dismantle the network that had caused so much harm. And while the scars of the experience remained, both on Shadow and on her, they served as a reminder of what they had overcome. In the end, Shadow's journey wasn't just about survival, it was about hope, resilience, and the enduring bond between human and animal. And as she stood in the quiet of the shelter one evening, the fading light casting long shadows across the barn, she knew that their story was far from over. It was just the beginning of something bigger, something that would continue to inspire and change lives in ways she could only begin to imagine.